All right, good afternoon. Welcome to Sociology 1. Still trying to get through the material here, and I don't know exactly what happened, but it's going to be hard for me to cover everything that I was hoping to cover this semester with the amount of time we have left. And we still didn't finish with research process, but I need to move on to our next topic. I think I'm going to finish up with one final point about doing research. We talked about the difference between quantitative and qualitative, and I think we got pretty thoroughly through that. Where I would normally go next was to talk about how you actually do research, whether you're doing quantitative and qualitative. But I don't know if we have time for all of that, but I do want to just talk about one specific thing. I want to talk about sampling strategy. In almost all forms of research, but maybe especially social science, we can't study everything that we're trying to understand, every case of it. We have to use samples. And so when we're studying a group of people, that's called our research population. That's the group that you're trying to understand better. And this is built into your research question. Whatever your research question is, it will identify a certain research population. We were using a pretend research question before where we asked, does intellectual curiosity lead to pot smoking among college students? That was our sort of made-up research question. What would be the research population of that question? College students. When we say, does intellectual curiosity lead to pot smoking among college students, we're talking about college students. Which college students? Well, all college students in America, one thing that's usually left out of it is which country are you talking about. But if it's an American study, if it's from an American university or an American publisher, you can assume, unless they say otherwise, that they're talking about Americans. So we're talking about, American college students. Well, I don't know what the N of that is, but it's well into the millions. Could be N of 3 million or something like that. That's a big N. There's no way we could study 3 million people. And almost anything we'd want to study in sociology, we can't study everybody in the research population. I was talking about my research last week about American youth and their voting habits. So my research population was American youth, all people 18 to 25. That's the population. That's a huge population. If you're trying to understand, what factors influence voting for Trump? Well, then you're talking about the entire voting population of the country. Those are big research populations. And in all cases, you need a sample. I mean, when they tell us that, so many percentage of Americans favor this or that political policy or this or that, candidate, they're doing it on samples too. And we've mentioned before, samples have much smaller N's. If you're doing, and this is a statistical question, how big should your N be if you're depending on your research population? If your research population is 3 million people, how big does your sample need to be? If your research population is, let's say, Yuba college students, we could do what's called a convenience sample. We could say, well, I can't do a sample of all 3 million American college students. That's too hard. They're all over the country. How am I going to talk to them? But if I wanted to study marijuana use among college students, I could, for convenience sake. It's called a convenience sample. It's convenient because it's nearby. But convenience samples have problems because are Yuba college students just like all the other college students in the country? No, we're pretty different in certain ways. We're more rural, we're more poor, we're more diverse. But even that is an N of 6,000. So even if we were just going to base our study on Yuba college students, we don't need to study all of Yuba college students because there's too many of them. And you don't need to because when it comes to things like surveys, and again, you wouldn't worry about sample size in a qualitative study. Qualitative studies aren't trying to prove anything. They're not trying to get a representative sample or try to talk about a whole research population. They're trying to generate hypotheses, so sometimes a sample of 1 is fine, or 10 or 15. But if you're trying to prove a hypothesis, if you're trying to test a hypothesis, like quantitative studies do, you need to make sure you have a good sample for doing that. And it's a statistical question. How many do I need to have a good sample? And I'm not a statistician. I'm not going to get too much into the numbers here with you. But when it comes to big studies of the entire country, it's quite common to have like an N of 1,500 if your research sample is the entire country. So your samples can be quite a bit smaller. And the magic of statistics is that from a small group of 1,500 people, I could give you a good estimate of what a million or 3 million Americans think. But the general rule about research samples is you want your research sample to look just like your research population. So you have your research population and you have your research sample. And I'm drawing this arrow because you're going to draw your sample from this. And you want to give everybody in your research population an equal chance to get into your research sample. If you give certain people more chance, that's called a biased sample. Biased with an ED at the end. People nowadays often just say bias as an adjective. But bias without the ED is a noun. But when you're using it as an adjective, biased sample, it means it's tilted towards somebody or tilted away from somebody. Bias literally means tilted. So if you are tilting your sample towards, say, white students and other students aren't getting a chance to get in your sample, that's a biased sample. If you're tilting it towards male students and female students aren't getting a chance. In other words, everybody in here has to have an equal chance of getting into here. And why do you want that? Because you want your sample to be representative. It's called a representative sample when that little group of people can be a representative of the larger group. In other words, it can stand in for them. It's like a little mini version of the larger thing that you're trying to study. And so you can be pretty confident if I've done a good sample and I've given everybody in this group an equal chance to be in this group, then this sample will just look just like this one, and I won't be biasing it against any certain group. And so if I find out, say, that 10% of my sample smokes marijuana, then I can be pretty sure that 10% of this sample does, within a certain margin of error, within like plus or minus 3 percentage points of error. And so you're trying to have a representative sample. And the way you do that is by being random. In other words, another way of saying give everybody in here the same chance to be in here is to say don't give anybody more of a chance than somebody else. So in other words, be random. Pick them randomly. If I pick them randomly from here, then I'm not biasing it towards anybody over here. And we've had a lot of problems in recent years with getting good representative samples of people. We were talking a little bit about this the other day. I didn't cover all this already, did I? We talked a little bit about social desirability bias. One reason that the polls that tried to figure out who is America going to vote for, and the polls were wrong. The samples kept telling them, we're going to vote for Hillary. And they were very sure, the experts, the quote-unquote experts, that Hillary was going to win and not Trump. And one reason is social desirability bias. I think some people said one thing in a poll when they were asked who you're going to vote for, and then did another thing when they were actually in the voting booth. So they didn't want to say in a poll that they were going to vote for this guy, but when they were voting, they did. But another issue is that the samples weren't representative. One problem is when you administer a survey. To give people a survey, how do you do it? Well, one would be pencil and paper. You just give people the survey on paper and they got to fill it out. Another way is phone surveys. Another way is online surveys. And can you think of some reasons why your sample might get biased? Well, phone surveys are very common. Pencil and paper aren't very common anymore. One problem with pencil and paper is your response rate. That's a word you should know. How many people actually fill out your survey? So it used to be common to mail people surveys at home, and they would just fill it out at home and then mail it back to you. But if you send out 1,000 surveys that way, how many are you going to get back? Are you going to get back 900 of them? No, you probably get back like 150 or 200. In other words, the response rate for pencil and paper surveys is really low. You send them out and people don't send them back, so it's a big waste of money. So most companies or individuals that want to do surveys nowadays might look at a phone survey, but how do you get a good sample in a phone survey? Well, it's very common in the past to just randomly go through a phone book and pick every 10th name on the phone book or every 15th name and just call. And that's random because people are in the phone book alphabetically, but there's no reason to think that every 10th name is somehow different from all the others. They're just randomly picked from the phone book. So you can assume that if I pick 1,500 people from here, they're going to look like this. But phone surveys turn out to be not random at all. And they're not turning out good results. They're very biased. So like when Romney ran for president a few years ago, his pollsters, he was a Republican. The Republican pollster is somebody who does the survey for the Republican Party. And they all used phone surveys. And they came back before the election and they said, Romney's definitely going to win. We know for a fact Romney's going to win. And then Romney didn't win. And then they were asked, well, how did you do your survey? What was your sampling strategy? And they said, well, we went through the phone book and picked every 10th name. But they ended up with a bad result. How do you think they biased their result? Who would you be giving more of a chance to show up in your sample if you're picking your sample by picking every 10th name in the phone book? Maybe you guys don't even know what a phone book is anymore, but that's part of why this is a problem. Who has their number listed in the phone book?
People that have landlines.
Okay, John, you've already heard some of this because you're in my other class. I want to give everybody a chance to think this through. So if you were going to go through a phone book picking names to call, who would you be biasing? Who would you be giving more of a chance to be in your sample? And who would you be not giving much chance to be in your sample? Ask yourself this. How many in here have a phone of your own? Do you have a cell phone? Is it listed in a phone book anywhere? Do you know? Probably not. So if you're going down a phone book picking names to call, who's ending up in your sample and who isn't, do you think? Who would you be in their sample? So older people, homeowners, people who own a home, people who own a landline, people who are old school in their thinking and still give their names out and numbers to phone books. So who are you getting? You're getting an older, wealthier, grayer population, more conservative. So when you ask them who are they voting for, a lot of them said Mitt Romney. If you had sampled an actually representative sample of Americans, then you would have young people in there as well, non-white people, non-homeowners, people like that. And if you had a fully representative sample like that, you probably would have gotten a more accurate picture. So that's what happened with Romney in those days, is they relied too much on phone surveys. Nowadays, what happened with Hillary? There again, some surveys did rely too much on phone surveys and didn't capture enough people on landlines. Another issue is caller ID. Nowadays, people can see who's calling them. And young people are much more likely than older people to screen their call and say, I'm not picking that up. Maybe nowadays certain kinds of conservative people are more likely to screen their calls. I don't know exactly what happened, and some of these pollsters are still trying to figure out why they were so wrong about the election. But that's part of the problem, is if you don't get a good survey, you don't get a good sample, then even if everybody's telling the truth in their poll, it's not an accurate result. It's not an accurate picture of America. So if you were trying to do Yuba College students, let's say we decided we're going to have a convenient sample. We're not going to try to get a good random sample of all college students in the country, but we're just going to focus on Yuba College. And Yuba College, like I said, has an N of like 6,000. We can't and don't need to talk to all 6,000 of them, so we want a research sample of Yuba College. So now we have to ask, well, what would be your sampling strategy? Who's got a good idea for making sure that we get a good sample of Yuba College students? Well, one question is, how many would we need? You might need around, let's say, N of 300 to get a good sample of the 6,000 people. Now, how could you do that? What if I just went and stood out in the quad here out in front of the library and said, surveys, I'm giving out surveys. Please fill out my survey. I will give you a gift card to Starbucks because can you pay? Should you pay for surveys? It's quite common nowadays for people to get paid to do their survey or to get entered into a raffle or something like that. So let's assume you could do that. It's not a problem necessarily. But what would be the problem with standing out in the quad saying, come fill out my survey? Who would you be biasing your sample against? Again, you always have to ask, and I'm trying to get you to ask and not just sit there and wait for the answer, but think it through, raise your hand, try to be smart here. Why would that be a good idea or not be a good idea? Again, the question you have to ask is, I'm trying to make sure everybody in my research population has the same chance to get into my research sample. And if I stood out in front of the library and handed out surveys, who would have less of a chance of getting into my sample?
Well, we talked about this before. Two, I'm going to give you the same answer.
Oh, we already talked about it?
Yes.
Okay, well then we'll move on then. So we did talk about sampling strategy. All right, so there again, your unwillingness to tell me anything means you just got review when you didn't need review. So now we didn't cover stuff we do need to cover for the exam. You could blame me, but I asked you at the beginning of class, did we cover this already? And you all said no. Now you're telling me you covered it. All right, so you got to hear it again. Let's move on then. You already know sampling strategy. We don't need to cover it. What we do need to look at is research on families. Where I'm going next in the class is looking at some specific topics, what would be called substantive topics. So your method is just your method. How do you do research? Your substance is what is the subjects of your research? What are you actually looking at? And so we're turning to a more substantive discussion now, not how do you do research, but what are people finding out, sociologists, about certain topics. We're going to start with families. And in both cases, I'm going to talk about schools too. Hopefully we'll get to that after Thanksgiving, but I'm going to try to cover families this week, which is appropriate if we're going on vacation to go see our families. What we're going to do in both cases is look at some recent articles, recent research studies that have been done, and try to not only learn what they're saying about families in schools, these researchers, but also learn a little bit more about how they did it. So the first one I want to talk about is called Divorce in Perspective. And it's by a sociologist named Stephanie Kuntz. Stephanie Kuntz writes a lot about nostalgia. She kind of writes a lot about the family and about the idea that people seem to remember families back in the day, back in the 50s of America, in a lot shinier light than they should maybe. But anyway, she's also written about divorce. And here again, she thinks a lot Americans sometimes falsely think that families were a lot better back in the 50s than they are now. And one thing that's different between the 1950s and now in America is that there's a lot more divorce than used to be the case. And the reason she wants to put divorce in perspective is she says, well, we have culture wars in America. We've had some culture wars over the last several decades. You could say this big election we just had was a big battle in that culture war over, what kind of country do we want to have? Is it a country which allows things like abortion and gay marriage and equal rights for women? Or are we going to have a society where men dominate, where no abortion's allowed, where women are in the home and taking care of children and gay rights aren't allowed? So the culture war has been about these basic questions, especially when it comes to families. Things like abortion, gay marriage, teen pregnancy, divorce. On the one side are, family values conservatives. I always put family values in quotes because, versus on the other side, liberals and feminists. And so this election was clearly a battle between those two kinds of sides in our society. It was literally a battle between a woman who's a liberal and a feminist and a man who calls himself a conservative. I don't know if he really calls himself somebody with family values. He's been married 3 times and cheated on his wives when he was married to them, but I think he thinks of himself as a family values person. But anyway, meanwhile, Hillary Clinton, who calls herself a liberal and a feminist, she stood by her man when he cheated on her. But anyway, when it comes to America, we argue in our society over these things. And when it comes to something like divorce, according to Kuntz, we distort it. The reason she wants to put it in perspective is she wants to say we need to look at it scientifically. When it comes to divorce, we argue about it in America, but we argue based on what? We argue based on like ideology. So Christians and conservatives will say, divorce is bad. We know it's bad because the Bible says don't do it, and we know that divorce is bad because our religion tells us so. But if you're not Christian, then why would you listen to that? Well, your beliefs tell you that, but my beliefs don't tell me that, so I don't listen to you. And liberals and feminists often don't listen to the conservatives, and they'll argue back and say, well, we know divorce is fine because, women need to be able to end marriages to men who beat them up or who are addicted to alcohol or drugs, or, of course it's good for women to have the ability to end bad marriages that are harmful to them and their children. So these two sides argue back and forth about something like divorce, but what are they basing it on? One's basing it on its Christian religion, the other's basing it on feminist ideology, saying we just know this is good. But again, a scientist, as we've said before, is somebody who never knows if they're right or not. That we have to look at the data, at logic and evidence, and try to determine an answer to a research question. So she says, let's not just argue back and forth based on religion or based on ideology like feminism. Let's try to ask scientifically, is divorce bad or good? Does it hurt people or not? And obviously, science can't answer a value question like, is it bad or good? But it could ask, does it harm anything? So you have divorce as an independent variable, perhaps, and ask, does divorce cause any problems? When it comes to problems, who are we worried about as a society when it comes to divorce? Who do you think, if we were going to measure, if we were going to go out and collect data, who would we want to collect data on if we're trying to figure out if divorce causes problems?
The kids.
The children. That seems to be who we're worried about. We don't really care about the couple. Oh, they broke up. Big deal. People break up every day. Hearts are broken all the time. But we do worry when it comes to the kids. Are kids going to end up worse off if their parents get divorced? And we're worried about that because, like sociologists, we want our society to function smoothly. And if there's a bunch of messed up kids, then maybe America won't function well if we have a bunch of messed up Americans. So she asks this as a research question. Her research question is, does divorce cause emotional and or school problems for kids? And what's her method? So that's the question. Can we determine if there's a causal connection between divorce and harm to kids? What's her method? Her method, the way she goes about answering this question, is what can be called a meta-study. People are using this word meta all the time now, but a meta-study is like a study of studies. In other words, she decided, do I need to go out and talk to a bunch of kids or do a survey or do interviews? Do I need to do a quantitative or qualitative study of kids? And she determines I don't need to because there's literally already been thousands of studies of whether divorce harms kids. There's been a lot of people who've gone out and collected data on kids' emotional and school problems and a lot of other things about kids and a lot of data on parents being married or not. So if you're trying to find data on this question, you don't have to try very hard. There's tons of data out there. But what she did decide to do was combine all the data. Combine data from thousands of studies. So she didn't do original research. Original research would be you go out and collect your own data and analyze your own data and come to your own conclusions. She also didn't do secondary research. Secondary research is when you just read what other people found out. And you say, well, Smith found this out and Thompson found that out. She doesn't do that. she takes their data. She says, well, there's all these other studies with their data. I'm going to take their data and put it into a new data set, create this big, new, huge, giant data set that's got data from hundreds and thousands of studies. And then I'm going to analyze it. So I didn't collect my new data, but I'm going to analyze with fresh eyes this new data, this data that's already been collected. And she runs the correlation. We didn't talk about this because we didn't talk about doing the research. But when you have data as a quantitative researcher, then you have to put it into software that can analyze the data statistically and try to find out, is X correlated with Y? And she finds out there is a correlation between parents getting divorced and kids having an emotional and school problems. But we also said earlier on in this class, correlation is not causation. So just because you see in the data that when there's parents that get divorced, then sometimes you find kids with emotional and school problems. That doesn't prove anything. Correlation doesn't prove that divorce caused those things. It just means if you look at a bunch of kids, and by the way, it's a probabilistic correlation. That's a word you should know. Probabilistic refers to probabilities. If you're a gambler or you like sports, you've probably heard about probabilities. Like, what's the chances that Kaepernick's going to throw a touchdown? Or what's the chances that the 49ers are going to win the Super Bowl? And the odds makers in Vegas, they determine the chances, and they will say, we'll pay you this much, 5-1, if this happens, because we know the chances are higher than that, and so we'll probably win, and you won't. But we'll pay you 5 times your dollar if this happens. Anyway, that's probabilities. And so it's a probabilistic correlation. In other words, she finds a correlation. When divorce happens, this happens more often. But are we saying that whenever divorce happens, kids have emotional and school problems? In other words, a 1-to-1 correlation would be anytime this happens, this happens. And that's not what we're saying. It's not a 1-to-1 correlation. It's also not accurate to say if your parents don't get divorced, then you won't have emotional and school problems. In other words, there are kids whose parents are divorced that have emotional and school problems. But there's many kids, in fact most, it's a minority of kids whose parents are divorced that have emotional and school problems. A small minority, like 10% or less. When it comes to kids who are married, parents who are married, there is a small percentage of kids from married households that have emotional and school problems. It's a smaller percentage than the percentage of divorced kids. But what we're saying is, what she found in this correlation is most kids don't have emotional and school problems, serious ones, whether their parents are together or their parents are divorced. Some kids of divorced families and some kids of married families have emotional and school problems. The chances are a little bit higher if your parents are divorced, a little bit higher the chances that you could have emotional and school problems. But again, it's not most kids. It's a minority in both groups, and it's just a little bit higher chance if your parents are divorced. So it's a correlation. It's not causation yet. We can't determine that. But it's a correlation, and it's a probabilistic one that isn't super strong. In other words, you would measure the correlation by something called a correlation coefficient. And although the correlation coefficient is statistically significant, it's not, huge, out of the water kind of thing. But here's another thing. Not all data are created equal. Some data in this big data set she has is flawed data. It's messed up data. It's not as good as the other data. So she says there is flawed data. Some studies are flawed. Remember, she did a study of studies. She collected data from many studies. Well, some studies were really well done and had really excellent high-quality data. And some studies were kind of poorly done and didn't have very good data. What makes a study good or not? Well, the clinical studies were flawed. Clinical means the study was done in a doctor's office. In other words, when they got their sample, how do we get our sample? Well, we go to a psychologist's office, and we found people with emotional and school problems. In other words, one way to go about doing this research would be, well, let's go find a bunch of people with emotional and school problems, and then find out if their parents are married or not. And so some studies did that. They found a bunch of people in clinical settings, like a psychologist's office. They found out that they had emotional or school problems. And then they asked, well, are your parents married or not? And a high percentage of people in therapy for emotional and school problems had divorced parents. Is that a good method? What is wrong with going to a doctor's office and getting people in therapy and saying, well, they're all in therapy and their parents, a lot of them are divorced, so that must prove that being divorced means having divorced parents means you're going to end up in therapy.
Not everyone can afford therapy.
Not everyone goes to therapy. So if you're talking about, I have a research sample, research population, in this case it's everybody. It's all Americans, because she wants to know if your parents are divorced or your parents are together, does that make a difference? Well, who has parents that are either divorced or together? All Americans. I mean, you either have parents that are together or not together. So it's all Americans, but we're trying to get a sample. And if your sample is people in therapy, well, have you given everybody an equal chance? We're supposed to give everybody an equal chance, and you just pointed out, well, people who can't go to therapy, they didn't get an equal chance to be in my study. So people who can't afford it, who else might not go to therapy even if they could afford it? We learned earlier in this class when we watched Tough Guys, certain people just are very unlikely to go to therapy. Men are very unlikely to go to therapy. So if you're looking at people in therapy, you're looking at a certain kind of person. It's what's known as self-selection bias. Because people chose themselves whether to go to therapy or not. Some people chose to and some people didn't. And if your method is, I'm only going to look at people in therapy, then you're giving people who chose to go to therapy or were able to go to therapy the chance to be in your study. And you're not letting people who didn't choose to go to therapy. And so you're biasing your sample towards people who selected themselves for your study. In other words, you didn't randomly pick people out of the phone book and call them. They selected themselves and put themselves into therapy, which put themselves in your study. And so your study's biased. It's not giving everybody an equal chance. And if you add more men in there or more... Also, another thing those studies don't do very well is have what's called a control group. If you're going to study the effect of something, like what's the effect of divorce on people, and you're trying to figure out if divorce had the effect of putting people in therapy, well, you better also study some people who aren't in therapy to see if divorce was a factor in that or not. If you're not looking at people not in therapy, you're not looking at all the people who maybe should be in therapy and aren't, and had married parents. Maybe being divorced just means you're more likely to go to therapy, not that you're more likely to have the problem. So in other words, it's not a well-done study. If you're not taking a random sample that's representative, if you're not comparing your sample to a control group that didn't receive the treatment or the divorce didn't have something happen to them, then you're not really comparing things in the way you should. And it's not a logical conclusion to jump to. That if I talk to a bunch of people in therapy and they all had divorced parents, I'm going to conclude that divorce caused them to be in therapy. That's not logical. So she says, well, let's take out the bad studies. If you take out the flawed studies and you re-crunch the numbers, you take this big data set, but you only have high-quality data in there that's from random representative samples that had control groups in it, then what do you get? So she did what's called a second pass. I'm calling it that. She did a second swipe at the data. Because it's literally like swiping it through a card. You're swiping it through the computer to see if it, a card reader, it's like running it through the computer to see what gets spit out. On the second swipe, when she took out the bad data, there's still a correlation, but it's much weaker. Almost to the point where there's almost no difference between kids whose parents are divorced and kids whose parents are together. There's still a slightly higher chance for the kids with divorced parents to end up with emotional and school problems, but it's almost equal. But it's still statistically significant, just not very strong. But we still can't conclude that divorce is the cause. We still have to note that correlation is not causation. And there's a third step involved in establishing causation. Did X come first and then Y? That was the first one. Does Y go up when X goes up? When people get divorced, are they more likely to have them? Yes. But there's a third criterion, which is, have you ruled out other possible causes? Could there be something else that explains both why people get divorced and why their kids have problems? So the third test is the test of spuriousness we mentioned. And that's where you go back here and you say, okay, well, I found a correlation between X and Y, but I'm not sure that X is the cause. So there's a correlation between divorce and emotional and school problems. But in the test of spuriousness, we have to ask, could there have been something here? Something that happened after mom and dad got divorced, but before I started having emotional and school problems at school? Is there something here that might have occurred? I also need to ask, this is called an intervening variable. Could something have intervened in between when my parents got divorced and when I started having these problems? Or could it have also been something that happened beforehand? Maybe something happened to me while my parents were together, while I was living with them. And maybe that thing that happened to me helps explain why they got divorced, but it might also help explain why I have emotional and school problems. And if that's the case, then maybe it doesn't even matter whether they got divorced or not. I was going to end up with emotional and school problems because of this thing. So here's where good scientists begin to use their brain. There's no data to look at yet. We have to try and use our minds to think about, well, what could happen to people in between here? You've probably known people whose parents got divorced. Maybe your parents got divorced. Maybe you saw a movie about people getting divorced. But can you think of things that might happen in between? Because what counts as divorce? If you're looking at data on who's divorced or not, what defines a divorced person? Well, you've signed divorce papers. You've signed the documents that make you a divorced person. So the question is, between the time when your parents signed some papers at the courthouse that said that they're divorced and when you started having problems, what are some things that could happen to a person? What are occurrences that may or may not befall a person when their parents have called it quits?
Maybe they fought a lot in the household, so you would always hear them arguing, and like that is why they got.
Does that happen after they got divorced? They fought?
That would be like.
You're talking about an antecedent variable, so you're saying maybe open conflict. Seeing my parents fight a lot, is that something that might lead me to have emotional and school problems? Even if my parents didn't get divorced, is there things that, even if my parents stay married but they fight all the time, could that be something that might lead to emotional and school problems? So you're suggesting that as a possible variable. But I was asking over here, intervening.
Having to move.
Okay, so maybe I had to change residence. Residential change, it's called. And I don't know about you, but that would suck in the middle of high school to have to pick up and leave your high school and go start a whole new high school in a whole new state. That would lead to possibly school problems, because how do you catch up to classes you weren't in the whole time? And it could lead to emotional problems. I got to make all these new friends, and I left all my great friends behind. And so, yeah, that would not be great. But that's not something that necessarily has to happen. The best divorce I ever heard about was one where the parents said, okay, we're splitting. You guys just stay here in your house. That's where you live. Me and mom, we're going to go back and forth. So they bought a condo, and they said, 1 week dad lives here with you guys, and mom lives in the condo, and the next week he lives in the condo, and mom will live here. So the kids didn't have to go back and forth. They got to stay in their house that they always grew up in, and mom and dad were the ones going back and forth each week. That sounds much better than me having to, move back and forth in between my parents or have to move to a whole new state or something like that.
I was gonna say financial problems. Maybe the parents, their incomes work better together, but when they split up and they have to do their own things, they don't have.
Financial problems is one you can put over here. Financial problems are one of the key reasons why people get divorced. But as we saw in the movie Two American Families, when parents are having financial problems, even if they're not divorcing, it can mess up the kids emotionally in school. But financial problems can also happen over here, because it's very common that people end up in worse financial shape after the divorce. And if you're suddenly living in an apartment on the bad side of town and eating much worse food than you ever did before, you might feel a little emotionally and academically challenged by those changes. But there again, is it necessary that you end up worse off than you were before? Is it necessary? or does it sometimes happen? Can you think of other things that may or may not happen? And I'm really wanting you guys to think. There's been a huge sea change in students today where they just don't want to think and raise their hand. They want to be told the answer, but I don't like doing that. I want you to think it through. This one should be fairly easy to think through. Here's how you should be thinking. One is, are there things that lead to divorce that I know about? Do I know any couples that ever broke up? Have I ever studied that issue? Have I ever heard anybody report on the news? Why do people break up? Because those might be some things that lead to divorce, but they might also be things that independently of divorce might harm kids. Financial problems are one.
Their parents find like another significant other.
Okay, so infidelity is a very common reason for divorce. And infidelity, even if your parents don't divorce, and there's certainly lots of kids who know their parents cheated on each other, but the parents didn't divorce. I had a friend in school, everybody in school knew that his dad cheated with this other girl in school, his mom. And we'd go like, hey, what's up? You like his mom, better or whatever? I don't know. And so if I was a kid and everybody in school knew that my parents cheated on each other, that might have some emotional and school problems for me, even if they didn't break up. Remarriage and stepfamilies. I don't know if you've ever had to deal with your dad's new wife and kids. My kids are having to deal with me and my new wife and their new brothers. And it's not that fun for them. It's easier to just deal with people you already knew, having to deal with some new adult and refer to her as stepmom. What are we supposed to call her? Is she mom? Is she stepmom? Or is she just Elena? What should we call her? I mean, there's all this challenge of having to relate to these new people. Now, there again, it can be handled in different ways. Some people end up hating their stepmom immediately. As soon as they hear about her, I don't even need to meet her, I hate her. Other people, work hard to try and make sure there's a good relationship between the kids. But there again, that could be a turning point in a life where you start developing emotional and school problems. But it doesn't have to do that.
You don't have a word for it, but like the pressure game where people keep asking you, like, are you okay? Are you okay? Your parents divorced, are you okay?
I call it kid in the middle. Well, pressuring might be one thing, but what's worse is when the parents put you in the middle of their conflict. You go tell that bitch, blah, 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 blah. You call up your mom and tell her that, blah, blah, blah. I'm not, you tell mom, So they send messages to each other through the kid. And if you've ever had to be the go-between between your two fighting parents, it's not a place any kid would want to have to be. So that's not a nice thing. And that could easily have emotional and school problems. But again, the point we're trying to make is divorce doesn't cause these things necessarily. They are things that may happen in the course of a life after people get divorced. And Kuntz went back and looked. She went and looked at her big data set. Are people who've experienced fighting among their parents, and by the way, open conflict, that can also happen over here. Seeing your parents fight after they got divorced is another possibly traumatic thing. And she went and looked at the data because the surveys asked, have you ever seen your parents fight? There's data on that. And people who say, I've heard my parents fight all the time, are more likely to have emotional and school problems, whether or not their parents ever got divorced. And people whose parents get divorced are more likely to have seen this. But even the ones over here who've seen this, but their parents didn't get divorced, are likely to end up over here. And that was true for all these variables we're bringing up. She went and tested them and saw, are they correlated also with emotional and school problems? And every single one of them was. So if you're finding these other possible reasons why kids might have emotional and school problems, and if you can also show that, yes, they're associated with divorce. Divorce happens and these sometimes are more likely to happen, but these, even if they're not associated with divorce, cause these problems. What other ones can we mention here? I want to make sure we get all of the big ones she talks about. One I think is interesting, and I think about this with my own kids because they're in the midst of this process. Too much TV. Putting your kids in front of the TV is a common strategy. If you're in the middle of a divorce, you're spending a lot of time dealing with lawyers, dealing with your ex, dealing with counting things up and stuff like that. And so your kids kind of go by the wayside for a little while because you're like, I'm busy with the divorce here. And so you may, as a parent, feel tempted to like, here's a bunch of CDs, DVDs, go watch a bunch of movies. Or here, I bought you a new Xbox, go knock yourself out. And if your kids are watching too much TV and playing too many video games, we already know, regardless of whether your parents are divorced, too much TV is strongly associated with emotional and school problems. If you've ever seen a kid after they sit in front of a TV for 6 hours, you know what they look like? Why do kids look like that? Because TV depresses you. Just sitting there, you feel physically depressed after a while, but all the commercials that come on are designed to make you feel bad about yourself. You don't have cool toys, you don't have cool clothes, you're not the prettiest, you're not the coolest. And so you watch all that, and so you come away from TV feeling like crap. And then also, if you're watching a lot of TV, you're not doing your homework. So, we already know too much TV is bad for kids. And is it sometimes common if people are in the process of divorce to give their kids too much TV? Yeah. But again, that's not the same as saying divorce causes emotional and school problems. It's saying sometimes when people are going through divorce, they make mistakes and put their kids in front of the TV too much.
My divorce friends, even before and after, they got played favorites between the two parents.
Uh-huh.
They got a lot of extra gifts with the parents trying to outdo each other.
Yeah, I don't know if that's an easy one to measure, because how would you measure that on a survey? Do your parents spoil one of you more than your other siblings or something like that? But how would you, it's common in research to have a proxy. What would be a variable that is measured that might indicate that that was going on or related to that? And I think that might be along the lines of too much TV or other kinds of indulging the kids as a way of making you feel better. I put them through this hell, well, I'm going to give them a bunch of stuff. And indulging your kids with too much TV or too much presents and stuff might not be such a good idea. One thing we didn't put up here, it's a really crucial one, is father or mother absence. If you just don't see your mom or dad anymore, or very much, as a result of divorce, well, that could certainly have emotional and school problems. But there again, is it necessary that if you break up with your spouse that you stop seeing your kids? No, it's not necessary. In fact, it's a bad idea if you love your kids. So stay in your kids' lives if you get divorced. But anyway, that's a variable. Another one is an antecedent variable. Well, one that's actually antecedent and intervening that we really should pay attention to here is abuse. Abuse is a very common cause of divorce. And when I say abuse, I mean all the forms of it. Emotional abuse, physical abuse, alcohol abuse, drug abuse. All of these are very common causes of why people get divorced. But even if people don't get divorced, these are commonly correlated. If your parents are abusers of one kind or another, the chances that you have emotional and school problems are very high. Abuse can also happen over here after a divorce. People can abuse alcohol or drugs or themselves or each other or their kids. And abuse, again, is something that, independent of whether your parents are married or not, is something that can cause you to have emotional and school problems. She mentions, I don't know why, she mentions antisocial mothers as an antecedent variable. And what she means by that is a personality disorder. She means when we have data on moms that have this disorder called antisocial personality disorder, that is highly correlated, first of all, with divorce. Women who have this disorder, have a hard time staying married. But women who have this disorder, even if they manage to stay married or never do get married, frequently have kids that have emotional and school problems. Now, what I don't get is why she didn't look into psychological effects of fathers. Maybe she didn't have data on that, or maybe it's not correlated with it. But I would certainly think that, having personality problems or mental health issues of your parents would be one that could create some mental health issues for you as well, whether or not your parents stay married. So this is a test of spuriousness. She went through and looked at all these variables that we're mentioning and tried to see, are they correlated with emotional and school problems? And they are. Whether they happened over here or happened in between. Some of them are correlated both with divorce and with emotional and school problems. So they're like an independent variable, like antisocial mothers, that correlates with high rates of divorce and correlates with high rates of emotional and school problems, even if parents don't get divorced. So all of this tells her that no, the answer to the research question is no, we can't conclude that divorce causes emotional and school problems. There's too many other factors that are also correlated with emotional and school problems to blame divorce itself. And there's many cases of people whose parents go through divorce and they never have any of these problems. A big question in the culture war that we talked about. Well, let's go here. So conclusion. So after you collected data and analyzed data and interpreted your data, now you're ready to offer some findings. Here's what I found out. And she concludes, first of all, we can't turn back the clock. Can't and shouldn't turn back the clock. In the culture war that we were just talking about, some people say we've gone too far as a society with divorce. Some people say we should make divorce harder to get. Make divorce more difficult. And she says, no, that would be a bad idea. That's what we mean by turning back the clock in this case. Why do we say turning back the clock? Well, California in 1971, I believe it was, California pioneered big changes in divorce. We created in California something called no-fault divorce. Before that in America, it wasn't that easy to get a divorce. If you didn't like your wife or she didn't like you, you had to go to a judge and you had to request that the court nullify your marriage or dissolve your marriage. And you had to prove to the judge that your marital contract had been violated in some way. So what do you think was the very common way that couples would prove to the judge that they needed to have a divorce? What's the evidence?
Cheating.
Cheating. So the most common reason for divorce before 1971 was infidelity. And there was a strange thing here because a lot of couples wanted a divorce, but they weren't cheating on each other. For example, back in those days, some men might be gay and were married to somebody they didn't love and just the marriage wasn't working out. And she knows he doesn't love her and she doesn't love him. And so they want out of the marriage, but you weren't allowed by the law to just end your marriage. So what did you do? Well, some people did what was called collusive divorce. They would break the law to get a divorce. Like, let's hire a hooker, put her in bed with you, we'll take a picture of you in bed with another woman, then we have the proof we need to show the judge that we shouldn't be married. So it's kind of like what happened with abortion when it was illegal. It didn't mean it didn't happen. People got abortions, but they did them in very dangerous ways. And same with divorce. It wasn't that people didn't end their marriages when it was harder to do. They just sometimes had to break the law to do it and things like that. And California said, why are we pretending that couples get along or forcing them to get along when they don't want to? I mean, if men are cheating on their wives, shouldn't she be allowed to leave? If he's abusing her, shouldn't she be allowed to leave? If she's cheating on him, shouldn't he be allowed to leave? Or not even cheating if they just don't love each other. I mean, we've changed our definition of why people get married. We used to be for, family and economic reasons, families coming together and families making economic bonds with each other and fathers, arranging marriages with other fathers of their children. Nowadays we get married for love, and if love is all about why you're married, then if two people don't love each other, then why should they be forced to stay together? And so California said, you don't have to prove it, you just have to cite irreconcilable differences. I'm not going to try to write that all down. I recently went through the divorce process. There were two reasons you could pick on the California form. One was irreconcilable differences, which just means we can't get along. We're different from each other, and we can't make it work. The other one was mental illness. I wanted to pick that. I'm like, she's crazy. I want to pick that one. Anyway, so we both picked, and she wanted to pick that for me, but we both picked irreconcilable differences. But the point being is, some people, especially on the cultural conservative side, say, well, we've gone too far. We've made it too easy to divorce because now anyone can go to the courthouse and say we want a divorce and the court will give it to you. And I can tell you, though, as somebody going through it, there's nothing easy about it. I mean, it might be easy to sign some documents, but the whole process is the hardest thing I ever had to go through. So don't let yourself think it's easy. But some people have said, let's make the law harder. Let's make it more difficult for people to actually end their marriage. because by making it too easy, somehow we've made divorce more common. And it's true that the divorce rate nowadays is around 50%. It actually dropped a little bit in recent years. Why do you think it dropped since 2008?
Less people got married.
No, because it's a rate. So it's the rate of married people that get divorced, not the rate of all people. But the economic recession, it costs a lot to get divorced. And so sometimes couples just sit there and say, well, we hate each other, but let's just hang out. We're not going to get divorced. It costs too much money for me to move out and stuff like that. But the divorce rate is 50%. But this is a little bit of a misleading figure. Because when people hear this, they think it's 1 out of 2 marriages end in divorce. And in a way, that's true. That is true. But does that mean that if you get married for the first time tomorrow, that your chances of divorcing are 50%? I might have already asked this in this class. The answer is no, because the rate of divorce for first marriages is not 50%. It's much lower than that. Most first marriages work out. Second marriages, though, and third marriages don't work out very well. And so what you see there is the divorce rate is high because a lot of people who got divorced the first time get divorced the second time and a third time. People who get married the first time mostly stay married. So Americans have been taught like our divorce rate is out of control. Americans just get married and divorce so easy now, and we don't care about marriage anymore. And in fact, you can look at this statistic and say, this proves we love marriage. Because the reason there's so many divorces is because there's so many marriages. People get married, it didn't work out, they divorce, then they want to get married again, and they try to find, so like President Trump, he's got 3 marriages to his name. Some people want to use that as a bad sign about him, but you could, and he did cheat on his spouses. But in my own case, if somebody said, well, you're not a trustworthy man because you got divorced, and you're on your second marriage, what a loser you must be. Well, my response to that would be, I love family so much that I really want to have a good marriage and a good family. I don't want to spend the rest of my life in a war zone where I'm fighting and yelling and being called names and calling names and having my children see that. I want a peaceful, harmonious home. That's what I'm trying to get. So you can fault me for not successfully achieving that the first time around, but I would say if it's not working, it's not necessarily a bad idea to end it. So she doesn't think we can turn back the clock, and she doesn't think it would be a good idea to do that because of her second point. Divorce is a process, not an event. Divorce is a process, not an event. What does she mean by that? Well, think back to this model we were drawing here. The divorce event is signing papers. If I go down to the courthouse and sign some papers that tell my children's mom that we're not going to be married anymore, did that act harm my children? Signing some papers? No, because putting my name on a piece of paper probably didn't hurt my kids. That act. So if you just define it as the divorce event, and you say, well, we should make it much harder for people to sign those papers. We should make them have like a waiting period. Or they should have to like go talk to a priest or something. Or we should make them prove they were cheated on or something like that. Let's make it harder for them to sign those papers. And she says, well, would that really stop the emotional and school problems? Was that why they had emotional and school problems? Because their parents put their signature on a document? Is that what happened? Or were there a bunch of events leading up to that one event? The fighting, the abuse, the kid in the middle, the personality problems. I mean, all the things we talked about as antecedent variables, those are all things that could happen to kids before their parents ever signed any papers. And all those things can hurt kids. So if we make it harder for the parents to sign them, aren't we then subjecting kids to more fighting of their parents, more abuse, more things? I mean, how are we helping the kids by making it harder for their parents to end it? Also, a lot of the problems with divorce happen after the divorce, not because of the signing of the paper, the kid in the middle, the financial problems, all the other variables we talked about. And these aren't inevitable. In other words, you can sign papers and not make your partner worse off than they were financially before. You cannot make your kids have to move far away. You cannot put your kids in the middle of the dispute with your ex. So it isn't inevitable that a divorce leads to these things, but there are things that happen along the process that harm people. And so she says we need to look at this whole process and how kids sometimes get harmed with it. But if we just focus on the legal side, people signing papers, we're not really going to help many kids, because we might make it harder for people to get their divorce to go through, but we did nothing about the abuse, the alcohol problems, the other problems that are really harming the kids. So she says if we really want to protect kids, if that's our goal with the divorce issue, then we should do things as a society that would actually do that. But just making it harder for them to get divorced or easier to get divorced isn't really addressing what actually might be harming the kids. So what should we do? What's her idea? How should we handle this? Well, she says we need to institutionalize divorce, is how she puts it. We need to institutionalize divorce. What she means by this is the term institution, she means in a functionalist sense. We learned earlier in this class about functionalism and the idea that society is like one big machine made up of different parts. And the different parts are the social institutions that make our society work. And marriage, for example, and family are one of the main institutions in our society. We as a society have a highly institutionalized marriage situation. What is a social institution? What does it have that things that aren't institutionalized don't have? Institutionalized, social institutions, what do they have? Well, for one thing, they have clear norms, rules. Rules about how you're supposed to act and how you're supposed to treat the other people in that institution. And when we think about institutions, what are we talking about? Well, again, going back to functionalism. Things like, well, schools are one, families, government, military, these kinds of things. What do they have? Well, let's take schools, for example. We have very clear rules about how you're supposed to act in school, how you're supposed to act if you're the student, how you're supposed to act if you're the teacher, how you're supposed to relate to other students, how teachers are supposed to relate to students. There's very clear guidelines. When it comes to marriage and family, if you want to marry somebody, are there rules you're supposed to follow? If I wanted to marry you, well, actually nowadays I can marry you. But if I want to marry you, are there rules I'm supposed to follow to make that happen? Are there norms involved?
Yes.
So I just grab you by the hair and pull you to the church and I can get you married? No. What am I supposed to do?
Some counties, I guess.
What am I supposed to do? First of all, get on one knee. First of all, you got to propose. So there's this whole thing about proposing. You got to propose marriage. And there's rules about how you propose. Like, are you supposed to get on one knee? Are you supposed to give them something? Oh yeah, a ring. It's supposed to be a ring. Any old ring? Like Cracker Jack box ring? Or what kind of ring? No, gold ring with diamond on it. It's got to be diamond ring. And so very clear rules. And then if she says yes, then what? Well, there's rules about like setting up at a, maybe an engagement party or something like that. And then, but even if you don't do that, you have to have like rehearsal dinner and the wedding itself and the reception and the honeymoon. I mean, there's all kinds of rules about getting married. And the American wedding situation's pretty lax, but take another culture like Sikh weddings are very structured in the rules, and Mexican weddings and other cultures and their weddings about the rules. When it comes to divorce though, are there clear norms? Do we say as a society, when you get divorced, here's the right way to do it. Here's a really good divorce. In fact, we might spend a lot of time growing up thinking about our perfect wedding. I know just how it's going to be. They're going to just look like this. My man is going to look just like this. I mean, especially girls grow up in America being taught and nurtured to think about your wedding, think about your marriage, think about the rest of your life, happily ever after. Did anyone ever say, well, also think about divorce because it might not work out, and when it doesn't, here's the way you're supposed to handle that? No, we don't tell little girls how to handle it if your man turns out to be an abusive bastard or something like that. We don't tell young men how to handle it. If you find you can't make it work with your partner, what's a good way to end a marriage? We just don't say it. We don't talk about it. We hide it. Partly it's because institutions also are very public. Marriage is a very public thing. You're expected to do things publicly. Get married publicly with a crowd there, have witnesses in front of people. It goes back to pre-modern times. In pre-modern times, the whole village had an interest in who married who, because we want to make sure this couple is right for each other. We want to make sure if this couple is having kids, that those kids are going to be welcome kids in the community and good positive contribution to the community. And so traditionally speaking, small villages in pre-modern times had a lot of say in who got married and how they got married, and the whole village was usually invited to the wedding. We don't live in villages anymore, so we don't really do it that way, but in a similar way, today's weddings are a lot like those village weddings. And you even have a portion in the wedding where they say, does anyone object here? Does anyone object to this couple getting married? And that's partly a way of saying, it's a public act you're doing. It isn't just a private arrangement between two people to go off and get married. It's a public act that's going to affect society. And so we want to say in that. Now, I've never seen anybody ever object. I went to a wedding once where I really wanted to object because she was my first love and she was marrying some other dude. And I was like, no, don't do it. I'm glad she did. She's better off with him than me. But anyway, nobody ever objects, but it's a holdover from pre-modern times. But divorce is a private act. We just say, you go off to a lawyer's office, you go off in private somewhere, we don't want to hear about your problems. You two that didn't work out, you go take care of it. And so people take care of divorce in a very private way, just by themselves. They don't involve their children in it. They don't involve their parents in it. And all those people who were involved in the wedding itself, that was a public act. And there were clear rules involved. But the Divorce Act is this private, quiet thing that people go off to do, and they don't really know what they're doing. There aren't clear rules about, should I hate my ex? Should I try to take her for all she's worth? Should she try to take me for all I'm worth? Should I run her into the ground and she'll be my enemy for the rest of my life? Should I try to get along with her, go back to being friends or something? I mean, what's the right way to divorce? And we don't, as a society, really have any rules about that. We just say, you go figure it out.
It's a question that I've kind of had before, but it's like, why don't in society we talk about a topic that's kind of darker? Like the whole society never brings up and they never bring it up in school until you get to like the later English class and they're like, oh, poets. And I'm like, but what about death?
Exactly. We don't like to talk about death. The big one I'm dealing with right now is old age. We don't talk about what happens to you when you can't really function anymore and who takes care of you then and what's supposed to happen to you then. And we as a society are like really in denial about this whole thing called old age. And I don't think we're preparing ourselves for it because we actually are facing a situation where there's going to be many more old people than young people. And we haven't really thought about like how are we going to manage as a society when there's more people who can't work than people who can. And so we just ignore it. But we're going to be hit with that problem in the face soon. But we don't like to talk about divorce too because it's darker and it's sad and we're a happy consumer economy. We like to talk about happy, fun stuff all the time, not dark stuff. But it's a social question too. But anyway, she thinks we need clearer norms about divorce. Like she doesn't know what they should be, but we as a society should spell out for people, here's how we want you to get, if you're going to get divorced, here's a good way to do it. Don't put your kids in front of the TV. Don't leave your partner in worse financial shape than before their marriage. Don't make your kids move far away if you can avoid it. These would all be certain kinds of rules or norms that if people knew them, they might follow them, and if they followed them, they might not make these mistakes that hurt their kids. Social institutions also have clear rights.
Isn't that what prenups for?
Some people have them. Some people don't like to have them. But there again, that's treating divorce as a purely individual act between two people. So you guys go make a little agreement between yourselves about what you're supposed to do when your marriage ends. And that might help them as a couple, but she's saying as a society, we should have a prenup. We should explain to people before you get married. Here's what might happen if your marriage doesn't work out, and here's some good rules to follow, some good do's and don'ts you might want to follow in going through your divorce. Clear rights and obligations, that's another thing. Marriages are very clear. Like, what is the right of the groom with respect to the bride? What are her rights? What are the rights of the father of the bride and the father of the groom? What are the rights of the mothers? What are the rights of the best man and the obligations of the best man and the bridesmaids and all those? So there's all these duties, but also rewards associated with marriages and other social institutions, just like this one. What are the students' rights and obligations? What are the professors' rights and obligations? But when it comes to divorce, like, do the kids have any say? Do the kids get any say in whether their parents divorce or how they divorce or where things end up? Or the kids just told, you just have to do what you have no rights here. You're just kids. You're not part of the divorce process. I mean, they will be affected by the divorce process, but we don't give them much rights or much say in how it should happen. When it comes to marriage, we have vows. And people say, I vow to do this for you. I vow to forsake all others. Well, it might make sense if you're divorcing your kid's mother to make some vows to your children about, I'm not going to abandon you. I'm not going to leave you in worse financial shape. I'm not going to do these bad things to you. That raises another part of social institutions, which they have rituals. Very frequently, these rituals are rites of passage, where you move from one status to another. Changing status is what rites of passage are all about. So, for example, in Mexican-American culture, when a girl turns 15, she has a quinceañera. You're marking your passage from being a girl being under the control of your father to somebody who now is more available to other men in the society. And so it's a rite of passage. You're moving from when you get married, it's a rite of passage. You're moving from single status to married status. Divorce is a change of status. You're moving from married to divorced, but we don't really have any ritual. There's no big party or celebration or funeral. I mean, there's no thing to mark. And what's the point of marking ritualistically somebody's change in status? It's to make you feel it more. I mean, if the village just tells you, you're an adult now, then you might not feel any different. Well, they told me I'm an adult, but I feel like just like I did yesterday when I was 12. But now I'm 13 and they say I'm an adult. Well, let's have a ritual where you have to go through some process that makes you feel different, that the whole public watched, the whole village saw you go from this to that, and the prayers were said, and the songs were sung, and other things were done, and so now you can feel in your heart, I really just got married. They didn't just say it. It really happened. I really just went through the change, and now I'm not a kid anymore, I'm an adult. But we don't have that with divorce. It's this, just one day your kids wake up and their parents aren't married anymore. And oh, now we don't see dad as much. And oh, now we have to go live at another house. And there's no real ritual. There's no community support saying, we saw this happen to you. We're here to get your back. We support you. There's none of that. And so she's saying there again, divorce might not be that traumatic of experience if it was surrounded with the kinds of things that other social institutions have, like clear rules, clear rights and obligations, some kind of ritual marking of the change in your life, and having the public be involved in that ritual in some way. So she says, I don't really have a blueprint. I don't have a picture in my mind of what this new approach to divorce would look like in our society. But she's pointing out the clear differences between how we treat marriage, which is highly institutionalized with very set out things. And people know how to get married, and they know how to show off to other people and say, look at my marriage, look how great my wedding was, and my marriage, and look at me on Facebook. But people don't say, check out the great divorce I just had. My kids are so cool with it. Me and my ex are like buddies now. We're like much better. I tried to say to my ex, I'm like, we had a terrible marriage, but I think we're going to have an awesome divorce. She's like, F you. But anyway, but what I try to explain to my ex, and she's sort of on my butt. Well, one thing, I think it is becoming a little bit more institutionalized than when Kuntz wrote this. One term that I was trying to use was the term co-parenting. Well, we're not married anymore, but we still have these kids in the world, and we still have to parent them together. We have to work together to parent them. And at first, my ex was like, F co-parenting, I don't know what that is, F you, shut up with your sociology words. And now, she uses that term. And I'm not trying to claim any victory here, but I was trying to explain to her, and she, I think, comes around to it. We could stay enemies the rest of our lives and hate on each other, but what will that do for us? What will that do for our kids? Does that make you feel better to feel full of hate? Does it make our kids feel better to see us still being full of hate? We were full of hate before we got married, and now we're still full of hate. Is that better for them? Or would it be somehow better to find a way to parent together without being married together? So we're trying to do that, but what I'm saying is giving people terminology is one way to help them through this new reality, and to just say, another problem is the term step-parent. That's part of the problem too. We don't really have a good definition of what a good step-parent looks like. In fact, most of our cultural ideas of what step-parenting is all about come from like Disney movies, where the stepmom is always evil and the stepsisters are always evil. So as soon as you find yourself with a stepmom or step siblings, you're like, I hate them, they're evil. Are they really? Isn't it possible they could be wonderful, great people that are a wonderful addition to your life, that make your life much fuller and better? It's possible, but if we are already predisposed to say bad, evil, like what does the term step even mean? I don't even know where that comes from. I don't know exactly what that means, but it doesn't sound good. And so she's just saying, if we're going to have divorces, which we do 50% of the time, maybe we ought to think about, as a society, a good way for people to go through them, or at least an acceptable way, and try to help them through it. And research is helpful here, because research is showing us certain divorces lead to kids that aren't messed up, and some divorces have kids that are messed up. So maybe we could, as a society, think that through and try to help people have better divorces. And step parenting, too, I think, is starting to change its status. There's been commercials recently. In fact, there was a movie. A term people are now using is blended families. So instead of step kids and step brothers and step moms, we say we're a blended family now. And there was a movie called Blended, and there are commercials nowadays that will talk about, we're a blended family and we're normal. And so making people feel a little bit more normal when it comes to divorce would probably go a long way to helping people feel normal and live normally. But if we define it as this weird, scary thing that we should never talk about, then it's not surprising that when people go through it, they end up a little messed up. So anyway, we will come back to more family research studies on Wednesday.